All right, so we are in, again, this is Ologies. We are covering man, sin, and salvation. This is part number 4. Hopefully, we will be wrapping up this little subsection in the next couple of weeks. Then we're going to move into the doctrine of the church, which is ecclesiology. And then the last one is the doctrine of end times, which is eschatology. So we're nearing the end of this broad study on systematic theology. And hopefully what it's inspiring you to do is to actually do your own studies. Some of these topics, as we've discussed even here, they don't always have definitive answers, and that's partly okay. There's some of the things that we've talked about even in this little sub-series. We've realized that there's not a definitive answer one way or another, and ultimately that's okay. We can all do our own deep dive into the Word, and I think that's really what if anyone takes off and does that, that would be the best sort of result, is going and doing your own sort of study. So last time I sort of left you on somewhat of a doctrinal cliffhanger, if you will, speaking of things that don't always have definitive answers. I wanted you to think about the question, where does your sin nature come from? This is stemming from our previous discussion in the last session, which was on the quote-unquote ingredients that make us human, our bodies, our souls, our spirits. We decided that ultimately it doesn't matter whether you think those are 3 things or whether you think those are 2 things. The important part is that what makes us human isn't just our flesh and blood, but also our spirits/souls. And we were also considering the idea that the origin of our souls is not as clear as perhaps we would think, and that this is also influencing our sin nature. So all of this is kind of wrapped up into one big sort of ball of a conversation. So anyone want to start us off this morning? Anyone have any thoughts? Did you do the homework? Did you consider where our sin nature comes from? Yes, Summer raised her hand really fast.
Well, I found this verse, and I wanted to just see what everybody else thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
It was Psalms 51:5. It says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me."
Mm-hmm.
And in other versions, it basically said I was conceived in sin and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a great verse, Psalm 51:5. This is, of course, David praying after his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, and this is his prayer of repentance, and he's acknowledging the fact that, at least from this verse, what it sounds like is from conception, he was a sinner. And he's recognizing that, he's acknowledging that fact, that there wasn't a time where he became a sinner. Actually, he was a sinner from conception. That's a great verse for understanding that part, especially where our sin nature comes from. This is a great verse in terms of making that particular argument. Anyone else have any thoughts on that, or perhaps some of the things that you came to on your own conclusions? Eric's waiting. Okay, Matt's gonna go.
My simplest way to, maybe in my mind, to explain it is, we're not God, obviously, and He created us. So since He created us, we're not Him. We're not holy like He is holy. So therefore, just in that fact alone, I don't want to say we're doomed, but we have that nature that it could creep in, and and then obviously with the verse that was just shared, I would probably say that's a good point to start.
Definitely. Eric, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to pretty much agree with the consensus that we are sinful upon birth. And the reason, along with Summer's verse is fantastic for that one that she found, but the whole reason there needs to be a virgin birth, I think that's the reason there's an emphasis on the virgin birth, because we inherit our sin. From a scientific standpoint, you'd say our DNA is corrupted. And so we only get corrupt DNA, which is why Christ had to be born from God. Had he been born from man, he'd have some corruptness in him. And I think that's why the virgin birth is so important.
Yeah, definitely. I'm probably going to play my cards, but the question is, where does your sin nature come from? Are you born with it, or do you fall into it? And that's sort of related to the idea, where do your souls come from? And where does our sin nature? All of that, I think, is wrapped up into one. And if I were to play my cards, I would just say this. toddlers don't have to be taught to think selfishly or sinfully. And if you've ever been around kids, you know this to be true. There's not a time where you have to, hey, think for yourself and grab that toy away from the other toddler because you want it. No, that comes from within. A verse that I don't have in my notes that probably would be helpful is to think of Mark chapter 7, where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and they're talking about hand washing. Remember, hey, why don't your disciples follow the hand washing rituals that we do? And like, we're doing all this kind of crazy hand washing stuff because we're making ourselves pure. And then Jesus says, don't you know that all impurities come from out of man's heart? It's not as if we receive sinfulness from our environment. No, sin comes from within. We are sinners to the core of who we are, and that means we need something different than just outward cleanliness in order to make us clean. So there's a lot of text, sorry for that, but my sort of questioning on all of these things, there's going to be lots of questions I want you to think of. If toddlers have a nature that wants to sin, and I think that's verifiably true, and I haven't done a lot of case studies, but I can just say that anecdotally, where does that sinful nature come from? And then also, this gets to our question of the origin of the souls. If God is the one creating souls, can he create sinful souls? Can he create souls that have a propensity to sin? Or is there a moment where if we are receiving our souls from God, like remember we identified there's two trains of thought. Our souls are either created by God, just like creation, ex nihilo, out of nothing, upon the moment of conception, or all of the ingredients for what makes us human, body and soul, are transferred within human DNA, we could say. Is there somewhere along the line where we become sinners? These are the questions that I think we can wrestle through, that I don't think we can pass over, and the reason why is because our hamartiology, which, by the way, is the word for the doctrine of sin, that's just the fancy word if you want to be fancy, if you want to talk about the doctrine of sin, hamartiology, we're going to get to that, it's the Greek word hamartia, will have a direct impact on your soteriology, the way you think about salvation. And this is going to be, I think, super, super important for us to consider. Because both of these, as we've said before, they relate to one another. And if you have one sort of view of sin, it will change the way you view the gospel, change the way you view what it means to be saved. I'm going to refer you once again to the State of Theology survey. I've referred this to you a lot, but I like to because, again, it gives you a pulse of what people are thinking. And what you know, it has a statement or something to respond to relating to our very topic. And one of them is, this is statement number 15, states, everyone is born innocent in the eyes of God. Let me just take a survey here. How many of you would agree with this statement? Good, unanimous. We are not born innocent. Now again, I'm playing my cards. We are not born innocent in the eyes of God. But what should concern us is the fact that 61% of evangelicals that we would largely agree with, that's what evangelicals is. It's like moderately agreement with us Baptists. 61% agreed with that statement that we are born into this world innocent. Now this is very, I think, important for us to consider. Number one, how they're getting there, but then also why they're trying to make this statement. Because my question is when does the shift happen? If we're born innocent, when's the moment when we become sinners? Because what they're essentially saying is that we are born guiltless, and that there's somewhere along the line, who knows wherever that's going to happen, somewhere along the line in a person's development, in a person's growth, as they're aging, as they're developing, they become sinners. And I think that this is kind of a big problem. It's a big problem to say that because if we become sinners sometime after we are born or even after conception, this is going to change the remedy that the gospel is meant to offer. And again, that's why all of these things are important for us to keep in mind. So this morning we're going to dive into the doctrine of sin. We're going to dive into it, and we're going to... it's not that I'm not going to answer the whole souls question, but I think we're going to be led to the same conclusion as we go forward. So, two big questions when it comes to the doctrine of sin. Number one, where does sin come from? And number 2, how is sin passed down? These are, I think, the 2 most essential questions when we're talking about sin, when we're talking about our sinful natures as human beings. These 2 are, I think, the most important questions to consider that also, by the way, relate to our soul's questions. So, we're going to answer the first one this morning, the origins of sin. Of course, we have to go to Genesis chapter 3. So, go to that really famous chapter, Genesis 3. And some people, by the way, will, and we can hash this out if you want to, but some people, by the way, will try to like trip Christians up by saying, this is not the origin of sin because clearly there was Satan, clearly there was a serpent. I would like to just differentiate, or maybe we can take this survey, and maybe the way I'm thinking is just wrong, but the way I think about it, or I'll just pose this question to you. Can angels sin? What? I think you can technically define them as sin, but I'll just think about it like this. I think Satan rebelled, and now he's evil, but sin is a human transaction against God, which means this is sin's entrance upon creation. That doesn't mean that evil hasn't existed before this moment. Clearly, it has in eternity past. Satan and his angels, as Eric talked about, a third of them, who knows what the number was, they fell in a very, very inglorious rebellion. So there's evil and there's rebellion, but sin is a human transgression of a law of God. At least that's how we're going to at least explore it. So if someone tries to trip you up on like, this is not the origin of sin, there's always been... Tell them that there was an angelic rebellion. This is talking about a very big difference between an angelic rebellion and a human transgression of a law of God. Anyways, that's just tangential. So we're getting into the origins of sin upon creation. Genesis chapter number 3. Easily one of the most famous chapters. Adam and Eve, as you know, probably perhaps from your earliest days of Sunday school, they eat the apple. Maybe it was an apple. I had a teacher one time try to tell me for certain that it was a banana. And that was the fruit of heaven or whatever. I'm not even sure why he said that, but he swore it wasn't an apple. But anyways, we're not going to really concern ourselves about that. The essential thing to know about this chapter is the fact that this comes at the end of God's creative work. So God, in chapter number 2 of Genesis, it says that he finished his work of creation and he rested the very first, you could call it Sabbath day, which becomes the rhythm of God's people as he goes along. Life in Eden was flawless. This is a really important point to make. That within this very historical moment of time, it's not mythical, that's another sort of tangent. People are going to try to convince you that the first 3 chapters of Genesis mainly are just poetry, they're an analogy, they're some sort of like biblical fiction, because then they can make all kinds of different arguments from there. It's important to note this is very much history, and this particular moment in history was flawless. Everything was perfect. As God said, if you go back to Genesis 1, the last verse, as he says, everything was very good. Everything was perfect. He had set everything into place. Everything that he had spoken into existence had a particular order, had a particular design. Everything was flawless. A good word to think of is the Hebrew word shalom. Everything was at peace. That's what that word means. Everything at this particular juncture was at rest, just like God was resting. Everything was at rest. Everything was as it should be. And the thing to consider is that this shalom is more than just like a peace of mind and that everything is calm and cool and collected. Actually, no. What this means is completeness, fulfillment, and harmony. All of those things to the ultimate degree. There was ultimate completeness with Adam and Eve in the garden as they were. This perfect man and perfect woman were there, and they were communing with each other, communing with God. They were communing with nature. They were doing their jobs within whatever role that God had given them. They were in perfect harmony. It was ultimate fulfillment. They were fulfilled. There was nothing. The other way I like to consider this shalom is that nothing was lacking. Everything was as it should be. And I think a great way to think about this is if we kind of use Genesis 3:8 in reverse, because this is a verse, as you might know, will come after they've sinned and they're kind of hiding in shame. But so let's read this together. Genesis 3:8, and then we'll kind of reverse it, which is, and it says, "They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden." Of course, this comes in a moment in which they're fearful of God coming down and communing with them. But let's reverse that. Prior to the fall, we can somewhat infer this was a normal occurrence. It's almost as if God has like a regular calendar appointment. Oh, it's time for my afternoon walk. And he comes down, communes with Adam and Eve, and they walk around the garden a couple times, and they're talking or whatever. Who knows what they were talking about? Who knows what was happening during those wonderful afternoon conversations? And this is what we're kind of getting at, is that they were in perfect harmony with each other, with their Maker. They had want of nothing. They were filled with all of the fullness that their Creator had given them. They had a purpose and a command to follow. Look at Genesis 2, verse 15. "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, 'You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of the good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die.'" That's important for later. But the point is, everything was in order. They had been given this mandate, as we heard earlier in chapter 1, of being in a place of dominion over creation, of serving creation, of being sort of like priests and stewards of creation. Even as they did all of that, this is what brought glory to their Creator. And I think the other important point to make is that, especially in these verses, when God tells them not to eat of this tree, it's not a restriction. And it sounds like it is. That's how we hear it through our human ears. But essentially what's happening is he's telling them, hey, this is how goodness works. I've called everything very good. I've put you exactly where you need to be. You have want of nothing. And if this is my standard for what is good. My standard for what is good means following my word, and it's not a restriction. It's not meant to put you down. Actually, this is meant for your flourishing, for your joy. This is for your fulfillment. This is why I've put that in place. This is kind of how God envisioned creation to function, you can say. Here's this. It's off limits. You don't need to worry about that. You have 99% of all the other things at your disposal. Except for this one, but don't worry about that, because I'm telling you everything else is yours. Everything else is yours to manage, to steward, to enjoy. And this, again, is God's standard for goodness. It looks like following him. This, again, gets to what we talked about last time, that God created us to follow, to worship, to ascribe worth to him, that he's made us for his glory. Ecclesiastes 3:11, he's created us with eternity in our souls. This is, again, how he designed it all to work. And I also think that this tree, and there's lots of commentary on this particular tree for whatever reason, is actually, we could call it a litmus test for trust. And that's sort of what's happening. Hey, do you trust that my standard for goodness, you could call it, is actually for your good? And we're going to see that mankind was deceived into thinking that, no, that wasn't actually true. So, Genesis 3:1. This is where our story begins. "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, 'Did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?'" So first, we actually see a serpent, or quote, the serpent is approaching Eve, and he's approaching her, as it says, in a crafty, a cunning, a deceitful manner. His whole motivation, of course, is treacherous from the start. He's not to be trusted. We always know that this is Satan, or at least that's always how we picture it. And just so, if you want proof that this serpent is Satan. It's not just in your imagination. Revelation 12, verse 9, where it says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world." This is within John's apocalypse, within his revelation, and I'm sure Eric will get to a lot of this, but it's also helpful to use this as sort of a backwards applicator, if you will, to sort of apply to the serpent here. That ancient serpent is, of course, the one that we're talking about here. So we can know that whatever this serpent looked like, and there's all kinds of ways that he is pictured within art, within Christian history and tradition, whether he was a serpent that had legs or whether he was just some kind of dragon. Who knows what he looked like? It doesn't really matter. He took the form of a serpent, and he approaches Eve with a dilemma. And notice again his dilemma. He said to the woman, verse 1, "Did God actually say?" Those are the most important words. "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden." So he approaches her with this question, a question of what God had said. And according to Satan, we're going to see what he's actually trying to get Eve to believe. According to him, God gave his creatures everything, or we could say, according to what we've read so far, God gave his creatures everything they could want or need. He has put them in this garden. He's put everything at their disposal, as we've seen. He's made everything very good. But then Satan is now sort of throwing some shade on that, and he's prompting Eve to sort of question in her own mind, what did God actually say? And notice again, verse number 2, "And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither touch it, lest you die.'" Now she's adding to what God's word said. God never said that you're going to die if you touch it. He said you'll die if you eat it. You'll die if you partake of it. That was his command if you look at verse 16 and 17. Eve's already stumbling. It's like if you're not good at thinking on your feet and someone approaches you with a question and you're like, well, it's hard sometimes to get the right things out and maybe you'll slip up and say something wrong. That's clearly what's happened here. She's a little flustered. She's approached by this serpent, and whether she's surprised by this snake that's talking or not, I don't know. But regardless, she's a little flustered. She's a little off her game. And she starts adding to what God actually said. She's applying more restrictions to what God had actually told them. And now, after that, notice what Satan does next. Notice what the serpent does next. But the serpent said to the woman, so he's going to press this matter. He's exploiting Eve's sort of doubt or even confusion. And the serpent says to the woman, "You shall not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. Then you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So this is his scenario. According to Satan, the Creator is a miser. The Creator, he actually he doesn't really have your best interest at heart. He's actually not watching out for your good. He actually hasn't applied everything according to his standard of goodness for your flourishing, for his glory, and for yours. That's actually not true, he says. What Satan is trying to convince them of is that God was actually holding something back. He knows God's been lying to you, Eve. God's been trying to get you to not concern yourself with that tree over there, because he knows that what happens is that you can actually be the God of your own existence. You can make your own shalom. That was Satan's lie. Satan's lie was that the shalom of Eden was a lie, but that they could be like God and make their own shalom. This peace, this harmony, this fulfillment that you have all around you, it's a lie. It's not actually real. It's just been sort of God's way of keeping you in line, keeping you in check, making sure that you don't question his standard, that you don't try to sort of resist what God has laid down for you and for the creation of the world. And of course, we know that this lie that Satan is telling is very alluring, because suddenly now there's this doubt that's creeping into Eve's mind. And her focus is being drawn away from all, again, of the blessings that were at her disposal, instead of to the one thing that we could say was being used as a symbol of God's cruelty. Look at what he's holding back from you. Look at what he is not allowing you to enjoy. He's actually just he's a tyrannical despot. God is not a God who loves you. He's not a creator who delights in giving to his image bearers all that he is. No, actually, he's a dictator. And he's keeping something from you that you would enjoy. And of course, we know that this is way too tempting for Eve and for Adam to resist. Verse 6, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So immediately they make this decision. They're tempted by the idea that they can make their own shalom, that they can make their own peace and fulfillment and harmony and completeness. And then it says, verse 7, then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and they made themselves loincloths. The effects of sin and rebellion are felt right away. It doesn't take long. They eat, and before it's even is going down their esophagus, whatever fruit it was, they are feeling exactly what they did. Immediately, they start scrambling. They realize their nakedness. And suddenly, shame sets in. Suddenly, guilt sets in. Suddenly, they are overcome with this urgency to cover themselves up and to hide. In the verse that we read, verse number 8, where they hear God is coming. Hey, where are you? Hey, it's time for our afternoon walk. Where are you? And they're hiding. Shame, regret, guilt, all of that sets in at that moment. And clearly, Satan had lied. I mean, clearly he did. As it says in John chapter 8, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, he calls Satan the father of lies. So this is no surprise for us. But again, I want you to see that this tree that we've talked about is not really the point of it. The point of the tree is to know how it's the standard of God's goodness, and how God is saying, this is how life works best, when this is in place and you follow my words. Satan's dilemma, his deception, was to question the standard that the Creator had laid down. And again, did you catch that phrase in verse number 1 of Genesis, where it talks about how the serpent himself was one who was made? So even he had rebelled against God's design, against God's standard for all of the created order, how he wanted all of that to work. Even he was in rebellion of that, and he's tempting others to rebel right along with him. This tree was a test which mankind promptly failed. We could go to that verse in 1 John chapter 2 where it talks about the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the pride of life, and how all of that is a great sort of grid to look at Eve's temptation. All of it is right there. And it's meant to prove mankind's trust in their Creator and his word, which they failed. So here we have to understand this. The fall, what we've quickly ran through, is a result of mankind's distrust. The first temptation of Satan was to distrust what God had said. Now, you can't actually believe your Creator because he doesn't really have your best interest in mind, and this is what led to disobedience and death. That distrust, doubt of what God had actually said, led to a disobedience, then led to death, as it talks about how death came into all of creation at this moment. And this, of course, gets to the verse that we're going to spend a lot of time sort of going over next week, which is Romans chapter 5, verse 12, which says this: therefore, just as sin came into the world, what we just covered, through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all because all sinned. This is what we just talked about. Adam is the head of creation. The blame falls on him. So that's why Paul is talking about him in this way, that death and sin came into the world through him. Sin came into the world in this way through distrust, and which led to disobedience, which led to death. Adam and Eve chose in that moment to determine what was good. God had called everything very good, but they chose that they could be the ones that could determine what was good for themselves. They were fooled into thinking that they could make shalom on their own. And then when they did that, they brought creation down with them. And this is what I want you to see here. That the scope of sin is bigger than you think. Again, look at Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's where we get that word sinned is hamartia, or the Greek word shata, which is the word that you'll see most often used for sin. And it means just kind of simply missing the mark. Think of archery. You're shooting an arrow at a target and it falls short. That's exactly what Paul is talking about. That in man's stupid decision making, his foolish trust of the serpent, he has been led into believe that he can make for his own glory. And yet, no matter how hard he tries, he's always going to fall short. He's always going to miss the mark. Why? Because he was created for a purpose that God has given him. So, this is sin in a nutshell. Sin is a violation of God's standard by replacing it with your own. You're saying, I don't need to operate by God's standard. I can make up my own standard. So even in this, I think, should help us that when we get into even little sins, little moments in which we are tempted to not follow what God has given us, what God has sort of told us in His Word, or what the Spirit is influencing us to pursue, even all of those little moments are little repetitions of the garden in which we are being deceived that this, whatever this is, an object, a person, an image that you want to lust after, a pursuit that you want to pursue, whatever this is, that Satan is giving you to say, this is what's going to fulfill you. You can make your own peace. You don't have to stay within the See, look at, God's so restricting. Look at how confining He is. It's a lie. Sin is a lie. It's all a big lie to say that you can get that and you can make your own fulfillment. That's what sin is. It's a violation of God's standard with the temptation and the belief on your part that, yeah, that's true. I don't have to follow God's standard. I can make my own. From stealing the smallest pack of gum to cheating on your spouse. The whole spectrum is covered by that. And maybe you're thinking, well, this is way too heavy for Sunday school. I'm sorry, but this is the doctrine of sin. We're trying to wrap our minds around this, because then this helps us understand the doctrine of salvation. But really quickly, I wanted to leave you with this, that the scope of sin is a lot bigger than you think. Sin fractures what God called good, which is the whole creation. And I've called it a rebellious reversal of creation. And if you look at Jeremiah 4, look at this phrase that stands out. Jeremiah is talking about the foolishness of the people of God. They're doing evil. And notice, I looked on the earth and behold, it was without form and void. Woo, alarm bells. Where did that come from? Genesis 1. When before creation, everything was without form and it was void. And then God brought that chaos into order through creation. And basically the prophet Jeremiah is basically saying this, that sin undoes what God has done in creation. It's an undoing of it. No wonder why Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that all of creation is groaning. He says that. So it's not just human beings that are affected by the fall. It fractures everything. It fractures what God called good. And this gets to the heart of what we're going to talk about as we continue talking about the doctrine of sin, but it gets to the heart of what God in Christ came to remedy. This is what He's come to remedy. This is the scope of sin also lets us know the scope of salvation. This lets us understand that as people who understand who we are human beings. We talked about anthropology. We are made up of body and soul. And also our body and soul is affected by sin. We need someone who can put all of that back together, who can put us back into shalom, who can rewrite all of the wrongs that we've inflicted. That's what all of this is setting up for. This doctrine of sin is heavy, but it leads us, I think, to consider and to cherish a doctrine of salvation in a much more true way. With that, I'm going to leave you there. Any questions or comments or thoughts that came to your mind as we were talking? Yes, Mr. Bill.
I read something that never occurred to me. It says, the serpent talked to the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why did he talk to her? Was Adam there? And later on he says that the two were together.
Yeah. So this is...
Did he come in after she already was eating the apple and gave her a piece? Or what? Why did he address her and not both of them?
So this is the big question, right? What was Adam doing while Eve was eating? I think there's a lot of credence to the fact that they were together, maybe not right on top of each other, and that's why the serpent was speaking to Eve, because he knew that he could deceive her better, perhaps. But also the failure of the man is, we could say, a failure of male headship, of male leadership, and he's not doing anything in this moment to resist that. There's a lot of ways you can go. There's a lot of imaginary things. The important thing to know is that there's, as we'll talk about this later, I think it's in Romans where it talks about how, or maybe it's in 1 Timothy. Regardless, in one of Paul's letters, it talks about how the woman was deceived, but the man basically chose. He wasn't deceived. He was convinced, you could say, into choosing that. So there's a little bit of, we could say, a line there, but we're not really told where Adam was. Of course, in verse 6, it kind of appears that he was kind of in the vicinity. So a lot of that is just conjecture. There's a lot of traditions that are surrounding that, but I think it's clearly a failure on both of their parts, and it's interesting, as we noticed in Romans 5, Paul is ascribing it all to Adam, which I think is a really notable thing to point out. Any other comments or thoughts that came to your mind? Yeah, Beard.
So C.S. Lewis, in his book Paralandra, which is actually rewriting of Paradise Lost, which is an expounding upon this passage, during the temptation, where it's actually a guy named Weston and a green lady, during that temptation, the forbidden fruit is actually fixed land because they all float around on floating islands in the sea, and he's trying to convince her to dwell in the fixed land because that is the forbidden fruit. But Ransom, the third party to that temptation, which is a changing from Earth to Venus, the story grows how C.S. Lewis wrote it. There's aspects of obedience that Ransom presents. It's like obeying God and tending to the land and everything that we're doing is a form of obedience, but it is self-serving, whereas there's no like we're just benefiting ourselves. If God hadn't told us to do this, we'd be doing it anyway. Whereas with the fixed land, it's something that we can step out of our will and into His will in following that obedience as a way of actually serving Him as opposed to just being self-serving.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of use that as like a paradigm to consider the tree and this quote-unquote forbidden fruit. And again, the obedience that's there, that God has laid down, is not like a cage. It's not a constricting sort of thing. It was meant for their flourishing. And the deception is to say that there's something better out there that is better for you to enjoy and is being prevented. That's always like the off-limits thing. It's always that idea that it's like that grass is greener syndrome. It's way better over there, and then you get over there and it's not as good. It's worse. And that's a sort of rudimentary way, but it's kind of a simple way to understand the temptation of the serpent. Any other comments or thoughts? Yes.
Does Satan take many forms?
I would say yes. He appears, well, even just in the verse that we covered in Revelation, it talks about him as a great dragon, a serpent. He's called the angel of light in the books of Corinthians. I would definitely ascribe to what Eric has talked about in terms of he can shapeshift, in terms of he can manifest in different forms. It's also hard to know what is symbolic. Like that Revelation verse is important because we would say that he's taking a form of a serpent. Can he take the form of a dragon? I don't know. Is it being symbolic, or is it being metaphorical, or is it being literal? That's kind of hard to know when you're getting into the books of Revelation. But I would definitely say that he is one who can take different forms. Eric's.
Yeah, I'm actually going to jump in a separate thing. I agree with everything you said there. Just that this is really interesting and sort of related but unrelated. But 1 Timothy 2, it's a controversial verse to especially Wesleyans and people like that. But it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, rather she is to remain quiet. And then if you follow up the verse, it actually links it to this. For Adam was formed first, then even Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So what's really interesting is how Paul ties this whole situation in the beginning to his explanation of 1 Timothy 2, which is really interesting. It's an interesting connection that because he doesn't just say, hey, I don't permit a woman to teach and drop it there. He ties it to this deception somehow. It's really interesting.
Any thoughts or comments? Anything else about this morning? All right, we're going to get into a little bit of the end of the doctrine of sin and then also the doctrine of salvation next time, so make sure you're ready for that. I'm looking forward to wrapping up this little subsection, and then we'll get into the doctrine of the church very soon.